She woke the whole street up. Nobody woke her. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the street was completely dark and completely silent. Then she arrived. An older woman in a heavy coat, carrying a bamboo pole that reached to the second floor of the terraced houses lining the street, walking with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this every morning for 20 years. She stopped at the first address on her mental list. She extended the pole. She tapped. She waited until she heard movement behind the glass, then moved on without waiting to see the face that appeared. She had 11 more stops before the mill gates opened. This was the knocker-upper, a real profession that existed for over a century in industrial Britain, and the woman who held the route in this particular street was not performing a convenience. She was infrastructure. The factories needed their workers at a specific time. The workers had no reliable way to get there without her. This is the story of the job that existed in the gap between what the Industrial Revolution demanded and what it had yet to bother providing. To understand why this job existed, you have to understand what the Industrial Revolution actually did to time. Before the factories, time in a working-class British community was loose and local. Agricultural labor had its rhythms, but they were set by seasons and weather, not by a clock on a factory wall. A farmer knew roughly when to begin and roughly when to stop. Precision to the minute was not how the day was organized. The factory changed everything. Mills, iron foundries, coal processing facilities, and a vast network of industrial operations that transformed Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries all ran on fixed shift schedules with hard start times enforced by penalty. Arrive late and you lost pay. Arrive very late and you lost your position. The factory did not wait. The machines did not pause. The shift began at the same time every morning, regardless of whether the person assigned to that machine had managed to wake up. This created an immediate and practical problem for the working-class households that supplied the industrial labor force. Personal timekeeping devices existed. Pocket watches had been produced since the 16th century, and mantle clocks were common in middle-class homes by the 19th century. But for a mill worker earning subsistence wages in a terraced house shared with multiple family members, a reliable personal timepiece was not a realistic purchase. They were expensive relative to working-class incomes. They required maintenance. They broke down. And a household that could not afford to replace a broken watch had no backup beyond guesswork and hope. The knocker-upper stepped into this gap. For a fee that ranged from a few pence per week to slightly more for unusual hours or distant addresses, she provided what a clock provided, but in human form, walking a fixed route before dawn and converting her own reliable wakefulness into a service that allowed everyone else to sleep until the last responsible moment. She was paid by individual clients who subscribed to her route, usually a weekly arrangement with a fixed price agreed in advance. Her route was her business, built over years in a specific neighborhood where she knew which houses held mill workers, which shifts started at 5, which at half past, and which clients needed more than a single tap to actually wake up. That last piece of knowledge, who was a light sleeper and who could sleep through nearly anything, was part of the professional expertise she had accumulated and that a mechanical clock simply could not replicate. The Industrial Revolution demanded that working-class people be somewhere specific at a precise time, every day, indefinitely. It provided the demand, the penalty for failure, and the poverty that made failure likely. The knocker-upper provided the solution. Now here is what a full pre-dawn shift actually looked like from the knocker-upper's perspective. She did not set an alarm. She woke herself, usually through years of trained habit that adjusted her internal clock to whatever her client's earliest shift demanded, typically somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning. Some knocker-uppers reportedly never fully trusted their own wakefulness and developed secondary habits to ensure they were up in time, sleeping lightly by intention, waking to check a mental calculation of the time, occasionally keeping a neighbor informed so that someone else was aware if she failed to appear on the street at the expected hour. The streets she walked were entirely empty when she began. This was before the milk cart, before the newspaper delivery, before the first shift workers themselves had emerged. She was the first human presence on those streets each morning, and she moved through them with the quiet authority of someone who owned a version of the city that nobody else was awake to occupy. Her tool varied by practitioner. The most common was a long bamboo or wooden pole, thin enough to be maneuverable but long enough to reach second-floor windows of the narrow terraced houses that lined working-class industrial neighborhoods. Some knocker-uppers used a shorter stick with a wire scratcher on the end, designed to make a distinctive rasping sound against glass without cracking it. Others, particularly in some northern English towns, used a pea shooter, blowing dried peas against the window from street level, a method that was quieter from the street and more surprising to the person being woken. The quality standard was consistent across all methods. She had to be certain the client was actually awake and not simply awoken, which required waiting until she heard a response, a voice, a movement, a light appearing behind the glass, before moving on. A client who was woken and then fell immediately back to sleep was her professional failure. She would not hear about it until the following week, when the client mentioned arriving late to work and implied, without quite saying it, that the service had fallen short. The social texture of these interactions was its own quiet world. She knew her clients the way a neighborhood knows itself, by habit and presence, rather than intimacy. She did not enter their homes. She did not share meals with them. She sometimes knew nothing about their lives beyond the window she tapped each morning and the shift time she was maintaining. But she was the first external contact between each of those families and the outside world every single day, which made her, in a functional sense, part of the daily rhythm of their lives, in a way that was hard to categorize and easy to take entirely for granted. But the question nobody in the neighborhood ever fully resolved is the one that makes this job stranger the longer you sit with it. Who woke the knocker-upper? Because if she slept through her own alarm, the whole street was late, and nobody had thought to design a solution for that. Here is the answer to the question about who woke the knocker-upper, and what it reveals about the social logic of the role. In most cases, the honest answer was nobody. She woke herself, as described, through trained habit and the kind of sleep discipline that comes from years of professional necessity. But this created a single point of failure in an otherwise reliable system. If she was ill, the street was late. If she overslept due to an unusual night, the street was late. If she died, which several documented knocker-uppers did during their working years without immediate replacement, the street was late until someone noticed and found an alternative. Some knocker-uppers solved this by having a family member serve as a backup, a husband or adult child who knew the route well enough to cover if something went wrong. Others arranged informal mutual agreements with neighboring knocker-uppers whose routes overlapped at the edges, a system of professional courtesy that ensured a second person was aware if the first failed to appear. In some documented cases, clients themselves took informal responsibility for their knocker-upper, checking by sound whether she had passed before they fully relaxed back into sleep, and getting up on their own if she had not. What none of this amounted to was a formal system. The knocker-upper's reliability was her professional reputation and her personal discipline, unsupported by any institutional backup. The factory owners who depended on workers arriving on time had no formal arrangement with the knocker-uppers who made that arrival possible. The mill did not pay the knocker-upper. The mill penalized the workers who arrived late. The knocker-upper was paid by the workers themselves, directly and individually, for a service the factory required but did not consider part of its operational responsibility to provide. This is the detail that makes the knocker-upper's role more than a historical curiosity. The Industrial Revolution created a precise timekeeping requirement. It imposed that requirement on people who lacked the personal resources to meet it, and it outsourced the human labor of solving that gap to a woman who charged a few pence a week and woke herself up in the dark every morning through sheer force of professional habit. The factory got punctual workers. The knocker-upper got a precarious living, built entirely on her own reliability, with no safety net, if that reliability failed, even once. The workers got to the mill on time, which protected their wages, which allowed them to pay the knocker-upper, which made the whole arrangement work. Every part of this system depended on her. No part of it was formally designed to protect her. We don't have knocker-uppers anymore. The alarm clock became affordable for working-class households in the early 20th century, and the role declined as reliable personal timekeeping became accessible to the people who needed it. The final knocker-uppers in Britain worked into the 1970s in a small number of communities, more out of entrenched habit and client loyalty than genuine necessity by that point, a profession that had outlasted its own reason for existing. What replaced the knocker-upper was not a better version of her role. It was a device that did the same function without requiring a human being to wake up in the dark and walk a street in all weathers for a few pence a week. The transition was unremarkable. No celebration of what she had provided, no acknowledgement from the factories that had benefited from her work without paying for it, no record in most cases of the specific women who had held specific routes in specific neighborhoods. She was infrastructure. When better infrastructure became available, she was simply replaced by it. But consider what this story actually is when you step back from the historical detail. A system created a precise demand it could not meet with the resources it was willing to provide to the people it was demanding it from. So, someone filled the gap for the minimum viable compensation through personal discipline and local knowledge that the system made no effort to support or protect. When technology made the gap filler unnecessary, the system adopted the technology and moved on without looking back. This pattern, the gap between what an institution demands and what it is willing to provide, filled by a person who absorbs the difference personally, has not ended with the alarm clock. It is the shape of every gig economy platform, every 0 hours contract, every informal arrangement where one party carries the risk and another party captures the benefit. The pole has changed. The window is different. The economics of who bears the cost of keeping the system running have not changed at all. Here is what I want to know. Is there something in your daily routine that only works because someone you never think about has already done something before you woke up? Tell me what it is in the comments. This is just one job that disappeared the moment it became inconvenient to need it. You already know where to find the rest.